Hello, welcome. We're so glad that you could join us. My name is Kelsey Ross. I am a senior product manager here at Appian working on our DevOps capabilities. And we're really excited today to hear a story about how Aegon was able to use Appian in order to integrate into their existing Azure-based CI/CD pipeline. But first, I wanted to come up here and tell you a little bit about the DevOps tools available within the platform. One of the great things about Appian is the flexibility with which it provides to facilitate your DevOps story. So maybe some of you in the audience don't currently have a CI/CD pipeline, and you came to this talk to learn more about the different tools and capabilities that are provided through Appian. For those stories, we do have an Appian-centric approach, and I am partially up here to shamelessly plug my own presentation tomorrow, where you can come and hear me talk about how to use Appian for faster and better DevOps, where you can create a complete CI/CD pipeline using all of the out-of-the-box capabilities provided within the platform. Now, we might be the center of our own universe, but we recognize we might not be the center of yours, and so we know there are some very mature existing CI/CD pipelines that we would need to integrate with in order to facilitate your CI/CD pipeline. For those stories, Appian provides the tools in order to integrate into that existing pipeline, and that's really what you're going to hear about today. Now, I can talk to you forever about all of the possibilities that you could create using Appian's capabilities, but what better testimony than customer testimony, where they've actually had success using those capabilities and integrating into their existing CI/CD pipeline. So we're really excited and grateful to have Frans here to talk to you about how Aegon has used Appian's tools in order to create an Azure-based CI/CD pipeline. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Frans.
Thank you, Kelsey. Everybody had lunch, so I will keep the pace up so nobody will fall asleep because it's always difficult to follow presentations after a good lunch. The presentation will be about our setup of Azure DevOps with Appian. And the presentation is divided in a short introduction of me and the team I'm working for at Aegon, the deployment strategy we use, how we have set up the Azure DevOps pipeline, of course a demo to show you everything from the view of the developer, the technicalities, which will show how we actually did it in Azure DevOps, and probably if you reach the end of this presentation, please then ask your questions, not in the meantime. And I expect after this breakout, everybody can directly start implementing it for themselves. A little bit about me. I'm Frans Stuifbergen, 12.5 years working for Aegon. I'm a hyper-automation enthusiast. I like to keep up with the buzzwords, so intelligent automation, yeah, hyper-automation sounds better. And I have a developer and business analyst background, and I'm working within the team hyper-automation within Aegon. Our team is enabling business units and supporting departments to work independently with the Appian platform and other automation technologies we have within our team. The other technologies are Blue Prism, which we use, or RPA with Blue Prism, business process management with Appian, and we have some machine learning capabilities in our team to put the intelligence in the process automation, and we are also delivering intelligent document processing solutions to our business units. To give you an idea what we are doing as a team, we consider ourselves a platform enablement and support team to make sure that teams can work independently, that the platform health stays good, because we have multiple DevOps teams to support. And of course, we inspire and advise the organization on hyper-automation and how it can help the digital transformation journey of Aegon. Some facts and figures. As we are in Appian Europe, we are going to zoom in on Appian, of course. We are working for 7 years already with Appian within Aegon. And we have over 110 applications of various types and sizes. And we have 10 DevOps teams with about 25 plus developers in total divided among these teams. And to give you a bridge to this presentation, the amount of deployments we performed last quarter on production was around 290 production deployments, so you have an idea on the amount of deployment cycles. The deployment strategy. I have to put one team in the spotlight of Aegon, which is not our team, but the Software Factory team, because they play an important role for Aegon in setting up and delivering agile software delivery to all the teams developing solutions within Aegon. So they make sure that there is a uniform way of deploying software, with Microsoft Azure DevOps as a tool. And they cover various requirements around IT maturity and security. So for example, we have to make sure that for regulatory demands, we can always prove what happens during a deployment, who did the deployment, who approved it, and what were the contents of the deployment as well. This is all covered within this pipeline setup, which everybody is using. To let this work, of course, we have to make sure, like, okay, which application is then doing which deployment. So in our CMDB, we have to register every application. The Appian platform we consider as a business application, and every cloud instance, the development test, etc., is considered an application service CI. And by using these CIs in the development pipeline, we can always track the amount of deployments. And for example, you can get interesting metrics because an application which doesn't have that much deployment tends to address technical debt in a worse way, because if you do multiple deployments or a lot of deployments, mostly technical debt is also addressed better. In this presentation, of course, there are many or a lot of deployment strategies to choose. And maybe during this presentation, you will find out this strategy does not meet the strategy I have in mind. Before you run out the room and think, okay, this is not it, I will show you how easy and flexible it is to set up Azure DevOps with Appian, so it will fit your purpose or your deployment strategy. Aegon has chosen the basic deployment strategy. We started with IBM Urban Code in 2018, and we migrated fully to Azure DevOps, and we are still using the basic deployment strategy because we feel, as a good advice here in this room today, that you have to start small while thinking big, and actually that's what we have done. To understand a little bit more about how you do the deployments, of course, Appian has a way of working and demands a little bit how you should do your deployments. So, of course, Appian has objects. Objects are related to an application, or objects can relate to each other. And we have identified 4 types of deployments to bring functionality from a development environment to the next. And of course, the teams can choose what their specific release type is for their deployment. Let's zoom in on our setup. Within Aegon, we have 4 cloud instances, and all our business units are working on the same cloud instance. The DevOps teams work for specific business units, so they work on the applications their business unit needs. And we use a user and entitlement provisioning solution within Aegon to make sure people can only do the things they should do because of their job. But also, of course, to allow developers to only access the projects in Azure DevOps which they are allowed to work on, because you can imagine that somebody from the bank business unit should not touch applications from the pension business unit. We are using Azure DevOps projects to identify the specific applications. You can have one project with multiple, or you can have a project per application. That is fully flexible. And within this entire setup, we use JFrog Artifactory for storing the artifacts, so the application contents in a repository. I know Appian also stores it, but we want it in this tool because it's our standard solution within Aegon. So we can always prove to auditors what happened in the past, even a year ago, for a specific deployment. And of course, we gather metrics around the deployments in a specific metrics collection. To be able to allow a developer, because it's not using the Appian native deployment functionality, which Kelsey will explain more about tomorrow, we have developed an Appian site interface to allow users to just actually identify what do I want to deploy, and that will use the personal access token of the developer to access the Azure DevOps repository, as we want to let this deployment go outside of the Aegon platform and then back to the platform again. And maybe you're now thinking like, oh my God, what does he try to explain? I created a tiny animation to hopefully help you understand better. If we have a developer is working on a user story, and at some point the user story needs to be deployed to the next environment. Appian wants you to use an application package, probably a properties file if you have specific environment constants, and a SQL script in case your change requires a database change. So the user will actually, in this case, the developer, create that package, and it will use that side interface I explained to push that package to the Azure DevOps repository. And that will actually trigger a pipeline in Azure DevOps, which will make sure the artifact will actually be stored in the JFrog Artifactory. That will also be gathered in the metrics collection. Once that is done, a release pipeline is started, which is actually pushing the package to the test environment of Appian. Appian will perform an inspection on that package, and if the inspection went fine, a deployment is done. And there is our user story on the next environment, and also we have stored the metrics as part of the metrics collection. The same applies for the stage environment, only we have a 4 eyes principle, or you want a review to be done on, like, do we want to deploy this functionality to the next environment? In case that user thinks, yes, that's fine, the same process repeats. An inspection will be performed, a deployment will be performed, and again, our user story has been moved to the next environment. And here the user, normally we use product owners or release train engineers to approve a specific release. So that person can also say, I agree. And then, of course, everybody can now expect what's happening, that the user story will end up in a production environment. So now we're going to use this animation to show a real demo how that works from a user perspective. I know the screen probably is difficult in the back to read the text, so I try to explain it as well. Hopefully it will be visible. So we're going to use the Appian package management solution, and you can work on various user stories. So we create user stories within the package manager. We link those user stories to Jira, because in the Jira there is the description what needs to be done. And once you have performed your change, you can, of course, add the objects you have changed to your package. So in this case, there is one object in there. And, of course, you can add your deployment properties file or your SQL scripts as part of your package if that's needed. And at that point, you actually have created your specific package. So how are we going now to move from the change you made to a real package which can be deployed? Again, we use the Appian package management functionality. So I'm going to change a expression rule in this demo. So I will change the text from hello world to hello Appian Europe. I will test if my test rule indeed still works and correct it if needed. And when I saved that change, I will make sure that you can see I changed that object for the last time. I will add it to a specific package. So I will add it to the package of the user story I'm working on. And now that package is done. So I can again go back to the total packages, and we decide now to actually use 2 user stories in one package. So I'm checking the contents of the package I just defined. You see the expression rule is there. I'm now going to select the 2 user stories, and I say I want to merge them into one release package, which we have called our sprint goal package. So this is a sprint package, and when you look now in the contents of that package, you will see actually the 2 user stories have been clubbed together in a single package. And it will also include your database scripts and properties files if you have done that. So this way you can create a bigger package from your separate units of work. When we have done that, we are going to make sure we prepare it for deployment. You can, of course, export the package directly, but we are not going to do that because Appian has a nice built-in feature for compare and deployment. This will give you an improved quality check on your package. Because what Appian will do is identify what kind of objects have been changed compared to the next environment. And it will also warn you if you maybe have security issues in your package, or you forgot to perform your rule tests, which are not up to date. In this scenario, everything is fine. So we will continue, and you can see now in our Aegon environment, we have blocked the direct deployment. So the user cannot continue here. It can only export the package. And this is where our journey will start to actually use the Azure DevOps pipeline to push this package onto the next environment. This is the Appian site interface, which we expose to our developers. So besides supporting some basic setup for new projects set up in Azure DevOps, we also provide an option to create a new release. So we will use that because we have that package ready. So we are going to create a new release. This is an interface which will actually use the APIs of Azure DevOps to get the projects you are allowed to see as a developer. You can define the name convention of your package, of course, if you have that. You can choose your data source in case you have database changes as well. We are using all the Appian native database with schemas and also our own AWS databases. And once we have pushed the packet, now the package is actually pushed through an API to Azure DevOps, and that triggers the build pipeline, which you also saw in the animation. And that build pipeline makes sure that this artifact is now stored in Artifactory. Once that process is done, so you can see actually that process is running in Azure DevOps, you can wait for the release pipeline to be triggered. At this point, the build is still running. So we will jump ahead now in time to see once that package is being resulted in a release pipeline, you can see that actually here our test release stage is executed or in process, and that will actually perform all necessary steps to deploy your application as a package to the Appian environment using the native deployment APIs. The output you see here, if it's readable, but that is the output from the API of Appian, which shows you what the result of the import is. So it shows you if there are inspection errors, how many objects were imported successfully, etc. So you also have a good check on what happened during the deployment, or when you have, for example, an approval flow, somebody else will also use this as a check. Do I expect this change as part of this deployment? You can also now see that the approval step for the next stage is activated. So you can configure that, who is allowed to do that or not. But here we will stop it because the animation already showed how that will work. Of course, when the release has been executed, you can check in the next environment in Appian. You will see that an external deployment arrived in Appian itself. You can actually look into the contents of that package, so you can still, again, see if there was a post-deployment process being triggered as a result of this execution, what objects have been imported as part of that. So again, you have a check here in Appian itself, what happened. Testing is, of course, an important part. We are using the Appian post-deployment process in this way. You can, for example, generate an email after your deployment was finished to say how is the execution test results. But you can modify this process to your liking, maybe use webhooks or other kinds of technology to talk to your Azure DevOps pipeline in case you use it in a different way. Of course, you can also post something on Teams where you say your deployment was successfully executed. So it's a handy feature which is also supported with external deployments. So how did we do this technically? How does it work? We are using that release pipeline. So here you see a big zoomed in version of that release pipeline. And when we start the animation, I will explain you how the triggers work. So to allow a release to be created, we actually activate as soon as the package arrives in the repository, it will trigger the build pipeline. After the build pipeline has been triggered, you can configure the test stage, the first environment which needs to be deployed. That after that build is finished, that you directly start deploying on the test environment. And for example, for the production environment you choose, we can only deploy it after you have passed the acceptance environment release and an approval flow. Here you can see we configured a specific release approvers group, which allows only those users to approve the deployment to the production environment. Zooming in on the tasks within the pipeline, so you saw the test environment being deployed. We have a native deployment API of Appian. The manual is there on the website. So we just looked at the manual and we created an Azure DevOps Service connection, which actually uses the deployment API logic of Appian. And before we do that, we have identified that we need to push from the site interface from Appian to Azure DevOps, like what kind of package am I deploying and how does the deployment API of Appian know what you're doing. So some of the parameters you provide as part of this release are being put in a file we push along with the package in Azure DevOps, and that will map the specific variables to the right API fields. Then I also explained the environment-specific constant. So in this example, you see that we actually configured, in this case, a data source which uses an Appian database, or not the Appian database, but our own database through JDBC connection. And we use the pipeline variables in Azure DevOps as a way to retrieve them during deployment. So you store your keys secretly in the Azure DevOps pipeline, and they will be used and replaced as soon as you do the deployment for that specific environment. And then last but not least, the actual service connection is built by ourselves because there is nothing delivered out of the box from Appian to talk with Azure DevOps, but it's quite straightforward to implement it. So here you see our service connection we share with all the pipelines. You can then actually have this step in your deployment setup. And that service connection, as I explained, has been built by ourselves. Using that documentation, and we actually can maintain this. If Appian decides to add new features to this native deployment API, we can also add it, of course, to the service connection. So every team within Aegon automatically has the same new features available. Before you can use external deployments, you have to configure your Appian platform to support this. So, of course, to talk to your service connection, you need to specify the credentials which your deployment pipeline will use to talk to the Appian platform. Then you can also specify how deployment is being deployed in which user context, because process models maybe need to run on a different user, so you can also specify your different user here. And when we go on, you can also say, do you want to have database scripts be deployed? We said database scripts are allowed to be part of this external deployment, so you can just activate them. And as you saw, we have the approval flow outside Appian, so we choose not to use the approval flow in our setup. But if you want it, you can still activate it. So this shows also a little bit more on the flexibility of how you can set up this with your own deployment strategy. To talk a little bit more about how we have positioned Appian, as I said, the deployment strategy is partly dependent also on how you position Appian in your enterprise architecture. We have put it only there in the process services area. So we do it for BPM case management. And we deploy a proxy API. For example, if you have a web API which talks to our front end, our consumer-facing apps, then we can deploy it as part of the team. The front-end team, for example, creates that public API which talks to our proxy API with Appian, and then you build your customer experience in the UX of, we use Angular within Aegon for our portals, and this way you have your end-to-end solution deployed in your landscape, and they all use Azure DevOps. So how does it look like in an example? You again see here the release pipeline of an application we support, which is called SSDF. And there is a web API in this application we expose to our front end. So this pipeline is, of course, following the logic I just explained in the demo, but we have another pipeline which is specifically used for deploying APIs within Aegon, so it looks differently and it also uses a different technology. But again, this is all the basic setup from our software factory team, so we only can add it to our own Azure DevOps environment. So in this Azure DevOps project, you have your entire end-to-end solution in one place, and you can quickly see what happens with your deployments and if everything has been deployed needed for this end-to-end solution. And of course, it's not always sunshine and glory. Sometimes you introduce a bug. And Appian uses the methodology to roll back by fixing forward. And we use our CI/CD pipeline to do the same. So if, for example, you introduce a bug in a version of an object, you can actually pick up the old version. So you create a new version from the version before you introduce the bug, and we do, for example, that hotfix deployment to our next environments. And once you have done that, you have time to fix the bug in a way that you can say, let's start again. You will pick again that version where you created that change with the bug in it. Now you will make the change in a way it no longer has the bug in there. And you can, of course, then deploy it as a new release. So this way, you can roll back, but you do not do this manually directly in a production environment. You use the CI/CD pipeline to push these changes through. And actually, that is the entire story I wanted to explain. And I think, looking at the green light here, I have done way good job in timing. Me and my colleagues are here during this event next 2 days, so if some questions which can be asked after I wrap up, then you feel free to connect to us during this event if you need more help or want to get more insights in how we have done this. So thank you for attending, and